The stars outside the viewport burned cold and distant as the transport shuttle approached Arcturus Station, and Elena Vasquez pressed her forehead against the thick glass to watch the massive structure grow larger with each passing second. She had dreamed of this moment since she was a little girl sitting on her grandmother's knee, listening to stories about battles fought among the stars and heroes who never came home. Now she was here, one of only 12 humans accepted into the Galactic Coalition Military Academy this year. And her heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat. The station was enormous beyond imagination. A wheel of metal and light spinning slowly against the black void of space. Home to cadets from 37 different alien species who trained together to become the peacekeepers of 1,000 worlds. Elena clutched her small bag of belongings and took a deep breath as the shuttle docked with a gentle thump. She was 22 years old, with dark hair pulled back in a tight braid and brown eyes that rarely showed what she was thinking. Her body was lean and strong from years of training, but compared to most of the species she would meet here, she knew she looked small and fragile. That was fine with her. She had learned long ago that looking weak could be an advantage if you knew how to use it. As she walked through the docking bay and into the main corridor of the academy, Elena felt the stares of alien cadets on her skin like tiny needles. A group of Kryn warriors stood near the entrance, their forearms crossed over their massive chests as they watched her pass with expressions of mild curiosity and faint contempt. 2 Scylla scholars floated by on their hover platforms, their 4 eyes blinking in her direction before they continued their whispered conversation. Nobody greeted her or welcomed her or asked her name. She was human, and humans were the newcomers here, the species that had only joined the coalition 80 years ago, when their first ship stumbled into charted space. To most of these aliens, humans were a curiosity at best and a nuisance at worst. They were seen as fragile creatures who lived short lives and possessed no natural weapons, no psychic abilities, no armored skin, nothing that made them special in a galaxy filled with wonders. Elena walked past them all without changing her expression, her boots clicking against the metal floor in a steady rhythm. She found her assigned quarters in the human section of the dormitory, a small room with a bed and a desk and a window that looked out at the stars. It was not much, but it was hers. And she set down her bag and sat on the edge of the bed to gather her thoughts. After a moment, she rolled up the sleeve of her uniform and looked at the tattoo on her left forearm. The image showed a black wolf's head surrounded by 7 stars, with the number 07 printed beneath it in bold letters. Elena traced the lines of the wolf with her fingertip and felt a familiar ache in her chest. This tattoo was not decoration, and it was not fashion. It was a memorial, a promise, and a reminder of who she was and where she came from. She whispered a name into the empty room, speaking it like a prayer. Sergeant Major Kira Okonkwo. That name meant nothing to the aliens outside her door, but to every human who served in the military, it was sacred. Her grandmother had been a legend, one of the greatest warriors humanity had ever produced, and Elena carried her blood in her veins and her teachings in her heart. The first week at the academy passed in a blur of orientation, sessions and physical assessments and classroom lectures about coalition law and interstellar diplomacy. Elena kept her head down and her mouth shut, watching and learning and memorizing the faces and habits of everyone around her. She noticed quickly that the 12 human cadets were treated differently than the others. The instructors were fair, but the other cadets were not always so kind. Small insults were common, like being shoved in the corridors or having equipment mysteriously disappear before training sessions. Most of the aliens did not bother with humans at all, viewing them as beneath notice. But a few seemed to take pleasure in reminding the humans of their place. The worst of these was a Torvan named Varax Kalthin. Stood 7 feet tall and was covered in thick scales that gleamed like polished armor in the stations. Artificial like his family held seats on the Coalition Council, which meant he came from wealth and power and had never been told no in his entire life. He moved through the academy like he owned it, surrounded by followers who laughed at his jokes and agreed with his opinions and looked the other way when he bullied those weaker than himself. Elena first noticed him during combat training in the second week, when he faced a human cadet named Thomas Park in a sparring match. The rules said to fight until the instructor called for a stop. But Varax did not stop when Thomas fell to the ground. He kept hitting and kicking until Thomas was curled in a ball with his arms over his head. And only then did he step back with a smile on his face. The instructor said nothing because Varax's family was powerful, and nobody wanted to cause problems. Elena watched from the edge of the training floor with her hands clenched into fists. At her side, she wanted to step forward and say something, wanted to challenge the Torvan and wipe that smug expression off his face. But she knew that would be foolish. She was new here and had no allies and no reputation. And picking a fight with someone like Varax would only make things harder for all the human cadets. So she stayed silent and watched Thomas limp away to the medical bay. And she promised herself that she would remember this moment. That night, Elena sat alone in her quarters and looked at her tattoo again. Her grandmother had faced enemies far more terrifying than any arrogant alien bully, had stood against monsters that would have made Varax run screaming into the void. Kira Okonkwo had taught Elena many things before she died. Lessons about combat and strategy and survival. But the most important lesson was this: patience is a weapon, and the warrior who strikes at the right moment will always defeat the warrior who strikes first. Elena pulled her sleeve down and lay back on her bed, staring at the ceiling. Her time would come, she just had to wait for it. 3 weeks passed at the academy, and Elena learned to navigate the unspoken rules of life among aliens who considered her species barely worth noticing. She excelled in her classes and earned top marks in tactical theory and battlefield analysis, which surprised some of her instructors, who had expected little from a human cadet. In physical training, she was careful to perform well enough to avoid attention, but not so well that she attracted unwanted challenges. She watched Varax continue his campaign of cruelty against the human cadets, tripping them in hallways and mocking them during meals, and always finding ways to hurt them that stayed just within the boundaries of acceptable behavior. Other humans had started to look to Elena as a leader of sorts. Though she had never asked for that role, they saw something in her eyes that gave them hope. A quiet confidence that suggested she knew things they did not. She told them to be patient and to focus on their training and to trust that their time would come. And they listened because they had no other choice. The day everything changed began. Like any other day at the academy, Elena woke early and dressed in her training uniform and made her way to the central atrium where the joint species combat drills were held every week. The atrium was a vast circular space with high ceilings and reinforced walls designed to withstand the impact of bodies and weapons. Cadets from every species gathered there to test their skills against each other. Under the watchful eyes of the senior instructors, Elena took her place among the human cadets and waited for the drills to begin. Her face calm and her breathing steady, she noticed Varax across the atrium, surrounded by his usual group of followers, and she saw him looking in her direction with a cruel smile on his face. Something was going to happen today. She could feel it in her bones, and she prepared herself for whatever was coming. The first few rounds of sparring went smoothly, with cadets from different species testing their combat styles against each other in controlled matches. A was paired with a Kryn warrior twice her size, and she used her speed and agility to score points against him before the instructor called time. The Kryn nodded at her, with something like respect in his eyes, and she nodded back before returning to her position. Then it was time for the free-form drill, where cadets move through the atrium in a simulated combat scenario and can engage anyone they encountered. This was when Varax made his move. Elena was crossing the center of the atrium when a massive scaled body slammed into her from behind. With enough force to send her flying through the air, she hit the ground hard and rolled to absorb the impact. Coming up on one knee to face her attacker, Varax stood over her with his arms spread wide and his teeth bared in what passed for a smile among Torvans. "Look at the little human," he said in a voice loud enough for everyone in the atrium to hear. So small and weak and pathetic, Elena rose to her feet without saying a word. Her eyes fixed on his face, she could see other cadets stopping their drills to watch. Could feel the weight of their attention pressing down on her like a physical force. Varax stepped closer until he was looming over her, his shadow blocking out the overhead lights. "Why does the Coalition waste resources on your kind?" he continued, his voice dripping with contempt. "You have no claws, and no scales, and no strength. You are nothing but soft meat wrapped in thin skin." Still Elena said nothing, and her silence seemed to infuriate the Torvan more than any response could have. His eyes narrowed, and he reached out with one massive hand to grab her left arm, his clawed fingers digging into her flesh as he twisted it painfully. "What is this?" he demanded, pushing up her sleeve to expose the tattoo beneath. "A decoration for your weak little body. Do humans mark themselves like livestock to remember which herd they belong to?" He laughed at his own joke, and several of his followers laughed with him, their voices echoing through the suddenly silent atrium. Elena felt the pain shooting up her arm, but she did not flinch, and she did not look away from Varax's eyes. She had endured worse pain than this in her training, had been taught to push through agony that would break most people. And this overgrown lizard, with his aristocratic arrogance, could not touch what she kept inside. Her lack of reaction made Varax's smile fade into something uglier. He wanted fear, and he wanted tears, and he wanted her to beg him to stop. But she gave him nothing except that steady, unwavering gaze. In that moment, he made a decision that would change both their lives forever. He released her arm and pulled back his hand, his scales gleaming as he swung his armored palm across her face with all his considerable strength. The impact snapped Elena's head to the side and split her lower lip against her teeth, sending a spray of red blood across the white training floor. The atrium fell into complete silence as every cadet and every instructor stared at what had just happened. Even Varax's followers looked uncomfortable, because striking a fellow cadet outside of sanctioned combat was a serious violation of Academy rules. But Varax did not seem to care as he looked down at Elena with triumph in his eyes. Certain that he had finally broken her, Elena slowly turned her head back to face him. Blood running down her chin and dripping onto her uniform, she raised one hand and wiped the blood from her mouth, looking at the red stain on her fingers for a long moment. Then she looked up at Varax with an expression that made several nearby cadets take involuntary steps backward. It was not anger that they saw in her eyes, though anger would have been understandable. It was something colder and deeper and far more dangerous. The look of a predator who's been waiting patiently for her prey to make a mistake. "You want to know about the tattoo?" she said in a voice that was soft but carried clearly through the silent atrium. It was not a question. Varax opened his mouth to respond with another insult, but before he could speak, an older voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Cadet Vasquez." Everyone turned to see Commander Gel stepping forward from the edge of the atrium, his long robes flowing around him as he moved. He was a Scythe, an ancient species known for their wisdom and their powerful psychic abilities. And he had served as the Academy's headmaster for nearly a century. His 4 eyes were wide with an emotion that looked almost like shock as he stared at the tattoo on Elena's arm. "That symbol," he said slowly, his voice filled with something that might have been awe. "You served under her. You were part of that unit." Elena shook her head once. Still bleeding but standing straight and tall. "I did not serve under her, Commander," she replied in that same quiet voice. "She raised me. Sergeant Major Kira Okonkwo was my grandmother." The silence that followed was so deep that Elena could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. She saw confusion on Varax's face and curiosity on the faces of the other alien cadets, who did not understand what was happening, but she also saw recognition dawning in the eyes of Commander Ziavel, and she knew that everything was about to change. Commander Zhao moved through the crowd of cadets like a ghost, his four eyes never leaving Elena's face. As he approached the center of the atrium, the other cadets parted before him in silence, sensing that something important was about to happen. Even if they did not understand what it was, Vorak stood frozen in place, his earlier arrogance fading into confusion as he watched the most powerful figure in the Academy approach the human girl he had just struck, Sergeant Major Kira Okonkwo. The commander repeated the name like it was a sacred thing, his voice carrying to every corner of the vast space. The Wolf of Carax, the seventh survivor. The woman who held the line when the gods themselves would have fled. He stopped a few feet from Elena and looked at her with all four of his ancient eyes. And in that moment, she saw something she had never expected to see from any alien. She saw reverence. "Your grandmother," he said softly, "saved my homeworld, saved my people, saved billions of lives across a dozen star systems. And her name is sung in our temples to this very day." Elena nodded once but said nothing, the blood on her chin already starting to dry. She had known this moment would come eventually, had known that someone would recognize the tattoo and understand what it meant. But she had not expected it to happen like this. Commander Zhivel turned to face the assembled cadets, his robes swirling around him as he raised his voice so that everyone could hear. "Most of you are too young to remember the Devour War," he began, "and many of your species were not yet part of the coalition when it happened. So let me tell you a story that every being in this galaxy should know." He paused, and the silence stretched on, every cadet hanging on his words. 40 years ago, a nightmare emerged from the dark spaces between the stars. A species we came to call the Devourer Swarm. Billions upon billions of creatures that existed only to consume and multiply and spread. His voice grew heavy with old pain as he continued. They moved through the galaxy like a plague, devouring entire worlds and leaving nothing behind but dead rock and ash. And our coalition fleet met them at the Battle of Nexus Point with every ship we had. He closed two of his eyes, as if the memory was too painful to face with all of them open. We were destroyed. Our fleet was shattered. Our greatest warriors were killed. And the swarm continued its advance toward the heart of coalition space where trillions of innocent lives waited to be consumed. The cadets listened in horrified fascination, many of them hearing this history for the first time. There was only one path the swarm could take to reach our core worlds. A narrow passage through an asteroid field called the Carax Corridor, and if they made it through, nothing could stop them. Commander Zhalfel turned to look at Elena again, his eyes shining with emotion. That is when humanity stepped forward and offered to do what no other species would consider: to hold the corridor against the swarm until the coalition could rebuild its fleet and mount a counterattack. He let those words sink in before continuing. The coalition command laughed at the offer because humans were weak and fragile and short-lived. How could they possibly stand against a force that had destroyed our mightiest warships? His voice dropped lower, filled with shame, but we had no other choice. So we accepted their offer and sent 300 human soldiers into the Carax corridor to buy us time. 300 soldiers, he repeated, against 20 million swarm organisms. Gasps echoed through the atrium as the scale of the battle became clear. They called themselves Alpha Force. And their leader was a woman named Kira Okonkwo, who wore the rank of Sergeant Major and the symbol of a black wolf on her armor. Commander Zhao began to pace slowly as he spoke, his words painting pictures in the minds of everyone listening. They did not try to fight the swarm in open battle because they knew they could not win that way. Instead, they went into the tunnels and caves of the asteroids, and they fought the enemy in the darkness, face to face, claw to hand, tooth to blade. They used tactics that no other species would consider because no other species was desperate enough or brave enough or stubborn enough to try them. They collapsed tunnels on top of themselves to trap swarm forces. They detonated explosives strapped to their own bodies to destroy hive nodes. They fought until their weapons ran dry, and then they fought with knives and rocks and their bare hands. The commander stopped pacing and stood in the center of the atrium with his arms raised. 19 days, he said, his voice rising to fill the space. For 19 days, those 300 humans held the Karax corridor against an endless tide of monsters. And every day they sent the same message back to Coalition Command. He paused and spoke the words slowly, giving each one its proper weight. We are still here. We will not fall. We will hold the line. On the 20th day, the Coalition fleet arrived with reinforcements and drove the swarm back into the void. But when they entered the corridor to find the heroes who had saved them, they found only 7 humans still alive. Commander Zhivel pointed at Elena's tattoo, 7 survivors out of 300. And Sergeant Major Kira Okonkwo was one of them, the woman who had led her people through hell itself and refused to let the darkness win. The wolf head represents Alpha Force. The 7 stars represent the 7 survivors. And the number beneath tells you which survivor she was. He turned to face Varax, who had gone very pale beneath his scales. You just struck the granddaughter of the greatest warrior the Coalition has ever known. A woman who faced horrors that would break your mind and emerged victorious. A woman whose tactics are still studied in every military academy in known space. Varax's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Kira Okonkwo wrote the book on how to fight every species in the Coalition. The commander continued, his voice hard now, including yours. She spent decades after the war studying combat techniques and developing strategies that her people could use if they ever needed to defend themselves. He looked at Elena with something like pity in his eyes, and she taught everything she knew to her granddaughter. Elena finally spoke, her voice steady despite the blood on her face. My grandmother believed that knowledge was more powerful than any weapon, and she wanted me to understand every species in the Coalition, their strengths and their weaknesses, their pressure points and their vulnerabilities. She looked directly at Varax. I have studied your kind since I was 6 years old. I know where every nerve cluster sits beneath your scales. I know which joints bend and which ones break. I know how you fight and how you think and how you lose. The atrium was silent as the weight of her words settled over everyone present. Varax had struck a human cadet, thinking she was weak and helpless and alone. He had not known that he was waking a legacy that stretched back through decades of blood and sacrifice. He had not known that the quiet girl with the mysterious tattoo carried the teachings of a legend in her mind and the fire of warriors in her heart. Now he knew, and now he had to decide what to do about it. The silence in the atrium stretched on for what felt like hours as everyone waited to see what Varax would do. His scales had flushed dark with a mix of shame and anger, and Elena could see the conflict playing out across his face. He could apologize and walk away, admitting that he had made a mistake and offended someone who deserved better treatment. But she knew he would not do that because his pride would never allow it. Her husband valued strength and dominance above all else, and backing down in front of so many witnesses would destroy his reputation forever. So he did the only thing his nature would permit, he straightened his spine and lifted his head and looked at Commander Gel with cold determination in his eyes. "I invoke the right of Carveth," he declared in a loud voice that carried to every corner of the atrium. A wave of shocked murmurs rippled through the crowd of cadets. Elena felt her heart rate increase slightly, but she kept her face calm and her body relaxed. She knew what Carveth meant because her grandmother had taught her about the ancient traditions of every major coalition species. It was a formal honor duel, a challenge that could not be refused without accepting permanent dishonor. The two combatants would fight until one of them yielded or was unable to continue, and no one else could interfere until the duel was finished. Commander Savoy's 4 eyes narrowed as he regarded Varax with something that looked like disappointment. "You would invoke the sacred right to save your wounded pride?" he asked, his voice heavy with disapproval. Varax nodded once, his jaw set in stubborn defiance. "The human has insulted my honor by suggesting she could defeat me. I demand the right to prove her wrong." The commander turned to Elena with concern in his ancient eyes. "Cadet Vasquez, you are not required to accept this challenge. Carveth is a Torvan tradition, and you are not bound by their customs." Elena wiped the last of the dry blood from her chin and took a slow breath. She thought about her grandmother, sitting in her old chair by the window, telling stories about the battles she had fought and the lessons she had learned. She thought about all the human cadets who had been bullied and humiliated by Varax since the day they arrived at the academy. She thought about what it would mean if she refused, how it would prove to every alien here that humans were exactly as weak and cowardly as they believed. Then she smiled, and it was the first genuine smile anyone at the academy had ever seen on her face. "I accept," she said simply. Varax's eyes widened in surprise, because he had clearly expected her to refuse. Then his surprise faded into eager anticipation as he began to imagine the victory he was about to claim. Commander Zierval sighed deeply, but nodded in acceptance. "So be it. Clear the center of the atrium and form the circle of witnesses. The Carveth will proceed according to tradition." The cadets scrambled to obey, pushing back to create a wide-open space in the middle of the floor. Elena walked to one side of the circle, and Varax walked to the other, and they stood facing each other across 20 feet of empty ground. "Cadet Vasquez," the commander said formally, "do you have any final words before the duel begins?" Elena rolled her shoulders and loosened her muscles as she replied, "My grandmother taught me something that your kind never understood about humans." Varax, she met his eyes across the distance between them. "We are not strong despite being fragile. We are strong because we know we are fragile. Every battle could be our last, so we make every battle count." Varax snorted with contempt. Pretty words from a pretty little human. Let us see if the granddaughter bleeds as easily as the legend supposedly did not. Commander Gelo raised his hand. "The Carveth begins now." He dropped his hand and stepped back, and Varax charged across the circle like a freight train made of scales and muscle. He expected to end the fight quickly with his superior size and strength, expected to grab the fragile human and crush her before she could react, but Elena was not there when he arrived. She had already moved, slipping to the side like water flowing around a stone, and her hand snapped out to strike a precise point on his neck. As he passed, Varax stumbled as his left arm went temporarily numb. His eyes widening in shock, he spun around and swung a massive fist at her head, but again she was already gone, ducking beneath his arm and driving her elbow into a gap between the scales on his ribs. Pain flared through his body, and he roared in anger, throwing punch after punch at the human who refused to stand still. Elena did not try to block his attacks because she knew that would be suicide. His strength was too great, and one solid blow would shatter her bones. Instead, she flowed around him like a ghost, always moving, always just out of reach. And every time he missed, she was there to punish him with another precise strike. The watching cadets grew silent as they realized what they were seeing. This was not a fight between strength and weakness. This was a fight between a hammer and a surgeon's. Vorax grew more and more frustrated as the minutes passed and he could not land a clean hit. His breathing became heavy and his movements became slower. And still the human danced around him like she was made of smoke. "Stand still and fight," he bellowed in rage. "Why would I do that?" Elena replied calmly, ducking another wild swing and striking the nerve cluster behind his knee. His leg buckled and he nearly fell. Catching himself at the last moment, Elena was bleeding from half a dozen wounds, where his claws had grazed her during her evasions, and one of her eyes was starting to swell shut from a glancing blow, but she was still standing and still moving and still fighting. Vorax finally managed to catch her with a sweeping backhand that sent her tumbling across the floor. The crowd gasped as she hit the ground hard, and Vorax pressed his advantage, charging at her with his claws extended, but Elena rolled to the side at the last instant and came up behind him. Leaping onto his back and wrapping her arm around his throat, he thrashed wildly, trying to throw her off. Slamming his back against the floor with her beneath him, she felt ribs crack, but she did not let go, squeezing tighter and tighter until his struggles began to weaken with a desperate heave. Vorax finally tore her loose and threw her across the circle. She landed in a heap, and for a moment, it seemed like she might not get up. Then slowly, painfully, she pushed herself to her feet. Blood ran from cuts on her face and arms. Her uniform was torn, and she was breathing in short, sharp gasps that suggested broken ribs, but her eyes were still clear and her hands were still steady. Vorax stared at her in disbelief. 12 minutes had passed, and the fragile human was still standing. His own body ached from dozens of precise strikes to nerve clusters and pressure points. His left arm was barely functional, and his pride was in ruins. He charged at her one more time with all the strength he had left. Elena watched him come and waited until the last possible moment. Then she sidestepped, caught his arm, and twisted her whole body to apply a lock that hyperextended his elbow joint. The crack of breaking bone echoed through the silent atrium. Vorax screamed and dropped to one knee. His arm bent at an angle that nature had never intended. Elena stood over him, with blood dripping from her chin onto his scales, her chest heaving with exhaustion, but her eyes burning with unbroken "Will yield," she said quietly, and in that single word was the echo of 300 warriors who had held the line against impossible odds. In that single word was the spirit of her grandmother who had walked into hell and walked out again. That single word was everything it meant to be human. Vorax looked up at Elena from where he knelt on the floor, his broken arm hanging useless at his side, and his pride shattered into 1,000 pieces. He had spent his entire life believing that strength was everything, that the powerful ruled and the weak served, that humans were nothing more than soft creatures, unworthy of respect. Now a human woman half his size stood over him, bloody and battered but unbroken, waiting for his answer with those cold, steady eyes. He could see the other cadets watching from the edges of the circle, could feel their stares pressing down on him like physical weight. Among them were his followers, the ones who had laughed at his jokes and cheered his cruelty, and he wondered how many of them were laughing now. "I asked you to yield," Elena said again, her voice soft but carrying clearly through the silent atrium. Vorax's jaw clenched and his eyes burned with the last embers of his defiance, but he was not stupid, and he could recognize when a battle was truly lost. He had thrown everything he had at this human, and she had absorbed it all and kept coming, had turned his own strength against him until he was the one on his knees. "I yield," he said through gritted teeth, each word tasting like ash in his mouth. A long breath seemed to flow out of everyone in the atrium at once. The Carveth was over. The sacred rite completed. And Elena Vasquez had won, but instead of gloating or celebrating or humiliating her defeated opponent, Elena did something that shocked everyone present, including Varax himself. She extended her hand toward him, stared at the offered hand like it was some kind of trap. Unable to understand why she would show mercy to someone who had treated her with such contempt. "Take it," she said. And there was no mockery in her voice, only a quiet certainty after a long moment. Varax reached up with his unbroken arm and clasped her hand. She helped him rise to his feet. And they stood facing each other in the center of the circle. My grandmother did not hold the Carax corridor because she hated the swarm, Elena said, loud enough for everyone to hear. She held it because she loved what was behind her. She fought for the people she wanted to protect, not against the enemy she wanted to destroy. She looked around at the assembled cadets, aliens from dozens of different species who were staring at her with new eyes. Hatred makes you reckless and burns you out from the inside. Love makes you patient and gives you something to fight for. That is the secret my grandmother learned in those 19 days of hell. She turned back to Varax. You struck me because you thought I was weak, and because my weakness made you feel strong. But real strength does not come from hurting those beneath you. It comes from lifting them up. Varax said nothing. But something in his eyes had changed. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something that might have been the beginning of understanding. Elena stepped back and raised her voice to address all the cadets in the atrium. Humans are not strong. We break easily and we heal slowly, and we do not live very long compared to most of you. We have no claws or scales or psychic powers. And in a fair fight against almost any species here, we would probably lose. She paused and let her words sink in. But we do not fight fair. We fight smart. We study and we learn and we adapt. And when we are knocked down, we get back up again and again and again until either we win or we die. Her voice grew stronger despite her obvious exhaustion. That is what it means to be human. Not to be the biggest or the fastest or the strongest, but to never ever stop trying, to face impossible odds and refuse to give up, to hold the line when the gods themselves would flee. Commander Jeevil stepped forward and performed a gesture that made several of the alien cadets gasp in amazement. It was a silent salute of profound respect, one that was traditionally reserved only for warriors of legend. And he held it for a long moment before lowering his hands. Today, we have all witnessed something remarkable, he said to the assembly. We have seen the spirit that held the Carax corridor, the fire that burns in human hearts. And I hope we will remember this lesson for the rest of our lives. He looked at Varax with stern eyes. Cadet Calthon, you will report to the medical bay to have your arm treated. And when you have recovered, you will serve 3 months of additional duties as punishment for striking a fellow cadet outside of sanctioned combat. Varax nodded in acceptance, not even trying to argue or use his family's influence to reduce the sentence. Cadet Vasquez, the commander continued in a gentler tone. You will also report to the medical bay. Those ribs need attention, and that eye should be looked at. Elena nodded and turned to leave. But before she could take more than a few steps, something unexpected happened. The other human cadets began to applaud. Then a few of the Kryn warriors joined in, clapping their 4 hands together in a thunderous rhythm. Then more cadets added their voices and their hands, until the entire atrium was filled with the sound of applause and cheering. Elena paused and looked back at the crowd with an expression of surprise. She had not done this for glory or recognition. She had done it because it was right, because someone needed to stand up, because a grandmother's spirit demanded nothing less. But as she saw the faces of her fellow humans shining with pride and hope, and as she saw aliens who had once looked down on her species, now regarding them with new respect, she felt something warm bloom in her chest. Maybe this was what her grandmother had felt at the end of those 19 days. Not the exhaustion or the grief for fallen friends, but the knowledge that the sacrifice had been worth it. That the line had been held. She made her way to the medical bay with help from Thomas Park, the same cadet who had been beaten by Virax weeks ago. "You did it," he kept saying, his voice filled with wonder. "You actually did it." Elena just smiled and kept walking, too tired to explain that she had not done anything her grandmother would not have done. That night, after the doctors had mended her ribs and treated her cuts and told her to rest, Elena sat alone in her quarters, looking at the stars outside her window. She rolled up her sleeve and traced the familiar lines of her tattoo. The wolf and the 7 stars and the number that marked her grandmother as the 7th survivor. "I hope I made you proud." She whispered to the empty room. On her desk sat a photograph she had brought from home. The only personal item she had allowed herself to carry to the stars. It showed a weathered woman in battered armor with 7 stars on her shoulder. Her face lined with age, but her eyes still bright with unbroken fire. In her arms she held a small girl with dark hair and brown eyes, and both of them were smiling. Elena picked up the photograph and held it close to her heart, somewhere out in the void, among the stars that her grandmother had fought to protect. She could almost hear a familiar voice speaking words of approval. "You held the line, little wolf. You held the line." And in the academy that had once dismissed humans as weak and worthless, a new legend was beginning to grow, the legend of Elena Vasquez, granddaughter of the Wolf of Carax, who had stood against contempt and cruelty and emerged victorious. The legend of a human who had reminded the galaxy what her species was capable of. The legend that would inspire generations of humans yet to come, teaching them the same lesson that Kira Okonkwo had taught her granddaughter so many years ago, that strength is not measured in muscles or scales or claws, that courage is not the absence of fear but the will to fight despite it, and that no matter how dark the night or how long the odds, the line can always be held by those who refuse to give up.